Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating and honestly totally misunderstood stories of military engineering in modern history. We're talking about France's massive static defense system, the legendary Maginot Line. The sheer scale of what we're about to explore in this explainer is just mind-blowing. And the lessons here, they go way, way beyond just military history. Picture this. 200. That's 200 miles, or about 320 kilometers, of heavy fortifications stretching all the way from Belfort in the south right up to Thionville in the north. So we aren't just talking about a simple concrete wall here. No way. This was a sprawling, ultra-complex network of fortresses built throughout the 1930s. The whole idea was to completely seal off France's eastern border from Germany. But that brings us to the ultimate question, right? If this was literally the greatest, most technologically advanced fortress system ever built, how on earth did it fail to protect France in just 6 weeks during the spring of 1940? Like, how does an unbreakable wall shatter that fast? Well, to figure that out, we've got to understand why they built it in the first place. Which brings us to Section 1, Preparing for the Last War. So, right after the absolute nightmare of the First World War, France faced a really harsh demographic reality. They had a population of about 40 million. Germany, they were sitting at around 60 million. The math was brutally simple for French planners. In any future war of attrition, France would literally just run out of soldiers first. So a massive static defense line was basically seen as the ultimate manpower-saving device. By building these huge fortresses, France could protect that entire eastern border with just a fraction of the troops it would normally take. And you have to remember, the trauma of World War I ran incredibly deep. That whole conflict had been this grueling, static war of trenches on the Western Front. Because of that, the French government and their top military brass were absolutely convinced the next conflict would look exactly the same. They planned for a defensive, static war simply because, well, that's the war they had just survived. But here is the grand irony in all of this. Back in 1918, it was the French army that actually pioneered mobile tank and mixed arms warfare. Their aggressive, mobile tactics were a huge reason they won the First World War. Yet somehow, just a decade later, the very nation that practically invented modern mobile warfare decided to bet its entire survival on a fixed, immovable wall. Let's move to Section 2, an engineering marvel. Now, despite the strategic flaws we're going to uncover, the actual construction was genius. It's truly breathtaking. Take the Tourelle à Eclipse. This was an amazing design by a Colonel Bussière. We're talking massive gun turrets made of steel-reinforced concrete, perfectly angled to mutually protect each other. But the absolute coolest part? They were retractable. If they came under heavy artillery or air attack, these massive guns would just descend straight into the ground. They'd completely disappear into the safety of the earth, literally like a solar eclipse. And that innovation didn't stop on the surface either. Up to 30 meters underground, they built a highly sophisticated subterranean fortress system. I mean, think about this. Narrow-gauge railways connecting bunkers deep underground. Spacious living quarters completely sealed against gas attacks. They had enough food and provisions to survive completely cut off for 4 solid weeks. They even had optical periscopes to check the surface without ever stepping outside, their own independent power generators, and a massive internal telephone network. It was basically a futuristic, self-sustaining underground city. So naturally, with all these technical wonders, the press just went wild. They bragged constantly about the strength of this system, and very quickly, the myth of the Maginot Line took hold in the public imagination. To your average citizen, and honestly to a lot of politicians, this was an impregnable, totally invincible shield. On to Section 3, the psychological trap. But you see, this heavy reliance came with a massive hidden cost, and it started rotting their strategy from the inside out. British General Alan Brooke actually visited the line in person, and he hit the nail on the head. He said the most dangerous aspect was psychological. Sitting behind an impregnable iron fence creates a severe sense of false security. He warned that if the line ever broke, the French fighting spirit would just crumble right along with it. The wall wasn't just keeping the enemy out, it was breeding complacency inside. And because they had this overwhelming, almost blind faith in concrete, France made a fatal tactical mistake. They severely underinvested in mobility. Yes, tanks were still part of the French army, but they weren't used as aggressive, concentrated attack forces. They were basically parked as backups to the static defenses. Even worse, they dangerously underinvested in crucial modern tech like anti-tank guns and air defenses. They literally put all their eggs in the concrete basket. Section 4. Bypassing the unbreakable wall. So how exactly did the enemy tackle this engineering marvel? Simple. They didn't. While France was busy preparing for World War I Part II, Germany had completely reversed its own playbook. They developed Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This was a highly mechanized, intensely aggressive strategy. They combined devastating air support from Stuka dive bombers with massive, incredibly fast-moving armored divisions, all concentrated on very narrow fronts. It was all about speed, shock, and just completely bypassing strongpoints. But the real shock was where they attacked. See, the Maginot Line didn't actually cover the border with Belgium because France just assumed Allied forces would stop any attack there. More importantly, they assumed the dense, hilly forests of the Ardennes region in neutral Belgium were totally impassable for tanks. Allied planners thought an armored breakthrough there was practically impossible. They were tragically wrong. German forces blasted through the Ardennes forest with unbelievable speed. They executed this giant, sweeping arc right through the Low Countries and northern France. And here is the single most devastating irony of the entire Maginot Line. The German army eventually swept back southeast and attacked the fortresses from the rear. All those massive fixed French guns, they were permanently pointing east. They were facing the wrong way. Suddenly, 30 French divisions were completely trapped between the German advance and their own unyielding defenses. The timeline of this defeat is just blisteringly fast. The Blitzkrieg attack kicks off in May 1940. By June 14th, Paris is captured. By June 22nd, the French national government officially surrenders. And it's not until late June that the remaining troops inside those bypassed Maginot fortresses finally surrender. Think about that. An entire nation's defense apparatus rendered totally obsolete in a matter of weeks.
Let's look at Section 5, the legacy of the line.
The aftermath reveals an incredibly stark disparity in casualties. During the fall of France, you had around 90,000 French soldiers dead, 200,000 wounded, and a staggering 1.9 million taken prisoner or missing. Compare that to roughly 29,000 German dead. Now, the 400,000 French troops stationed inside the Maginot Line put up an incredibly brave, spirited defense. But because their static strategy was totally outmatched by a highly mobile enemy, all that bravery just couldn't prevent a catastrophic national collapse. But here's a crazy fact that usually gets lost in the history books. The physical Maginot Line actually worked as an engineering project. The fortifications themselves survived. German artillery and Stukas pounded those bunkers over and over, but the concrete and steel held up so well that not a single one of the main fortresses fell in combat before the national surrender. The walls held perfectly. It was the strategy of relying on them that completely failed. And because the engineering was so rock solid, the Maginot Line had a really surprising post-war life. In a pretty dark twist, the German army actually used parts of the line to defend against the advancing Allies later in 1944. Then, in the 1950s, France went in and restored parts of it as a deterrent during the Cold War. Even today, over 20 different sites are still maintained for the public. So what's the ultimate takeaway here? The Maginot Line is history's absolute ultimate cautionary tale against fighting the next war with the tactics of the last. It proves the immense danger of over-relying on a single, inflexible solution, no matter how technologically advanced or well-funded it might be. When the world changes its rules, a static defense just becomes a trap. So I want to leave you with a question to think about, something that goes way beyond military history. In your own life, in your career, or in your business, what static defenses are you relying on in a fast-moving world? Are you busy building an impenetrable wall facing east while the future is speeding through the forest right behind you? It's definitely something we all need to consider. Thanks for joining me on this explainer today.